Dim the lights. Let the room grow still. Imagine the faint hum of night air, the weight of history pressing in. This is not the history of speeches or generals, not the tidy dates of battles and treaties. This is the history lived in the shadows, in cabins of rough-hewn wood, in fields stretching past the horizon, in voices that rose in song where no pen was allowed to write. Slavery in the United States was not an edge of history. It was its backbone. Cotton built fortunes, sugar and tobacco fed empires, and every ledger of wealth was balanced on the backs of enslaved men, women, and children. Yet their lives, their inner worlds, were rarely recorded. So we turn now, slowly, to what the records don't say. To the nights after the long labor, to the dirt floors and flickering firelight, to the human breath of endurance where silence has too often been mistaken for absence. The day's labor is over, but the body still remembers. The muscles ache, the palms sting, the back throbs from bending in the fields. The sun has set, yet the weight of it lingers. Enslaved men, women, and children shuffle back to the quarters, the collection of cabins where the night will be spent before dawn pulls them into work again. Imagine the layout. Cabins arranged in rough lines, sometimes facing one another, sometimes scattered along the edge of a field. Each is built of wood, often hastily thrown together from pine logs or rough planks, with wide gaps that allow wind, rain, and insects to move freely. There is rarely paint, rarely glass for the windows. The floor is not made of boards, but dirt, packed down by years of footsteps, worn smooth in some places, uneven in others. Inside, space is cramped. Families crowd together. Sometimes an entire family shares a single one-room cabin. Sometimes 2 or 3 families are forced into the same space. Privacy is almost non-existent. In the corner, a straw mattress may serve as a bed, or sometimes just a pallet of old blankets on the ground. A wooden stool, a broken pot, a few hand-fashioned tools might be all the possessions they own. Smoke lingers thick in the air. Cooking fires are often built indoors, with only a small opening in the roof to vent the smoke. The smell of burning wood clings to skin and clothing, mixing with the scent of earth and sweat. Breathing is heavy, eyes sting, but the fire is necessary, both for warmth in winter and for cooking what little food can be eaten at the end of the day. Meals are meager. Most enslaved people are given weekly rations by the enslaver. Cornmeal, a little salt pork or bacon, perhaps molasses, beans, or peas. These rations are meant to sustain bodies for hard labor, but are barely enough to ward off hunger. To survive, enslaved families cultivate small gardens if allowed, growing collard greens, sweet potatoes, okra, or squash. Some raise chickens or fish in nearby streams. Others trap small animals, a possum, raccoon, rabbit, when possible. Food is stretched, shared, transformed into stews that simmer slowly in blackened iron pots over the fire. Children gather close as supper is prepared. They sit on the dirt floor, eyes watching as cornmeal is stirred into mush or cakes. A mother spoons out food carefully, making sure every mouth has something, even if the portions are small. Hunger is a constant shadow, and yet within this hardship, life persists. Families laugh, whisper, argue. Children play in the dirt outside the cabin, their laughter echoing against the wooden walls before being hushed by weary parents. A father may mend a tool in the dim light, his hands still swollen from the fields. A mother braids her daughter's hair, combing gently with fingers. These small acts become anchors. proof that even within bondage, people claimed what pieces of humanity they could. As darkness settles more deeply, the sounds of the quarters rise, the sharp cry of an infant, the soft murmur of women exchanging words as they shell beans or patch clothing, the low rhythmic hum of a man singing to himself, his voice barely audible but steady, the barking of dogs in the distance set loose by overseers to discourage escape, the cry of crickets, the croak of frogs, the endless chorus of the southern night. And then, stories. Storytelling is one of the most enduring rituals of the quarters. Parents tell children trickster tales passed down from African roots and reshaped in the New World. Br'er Rabbit, clever and cunning, always outsmarts larger, stronger foes. In these tales, wit defeats brute force, and survival belongs not to the powerful but to the clever. Children listen wide-eyed, absorbing lessons disguised as entertainment. These stories are more than folklore. They are tools of endurance, teaching resilience in a world designed to crush the spirit. Songs follow, sometimes soft, sometimes rising loud enough to carry across the fields. Work songs, spirituals, lullabies. The air fills, the sound comes before the light, a horn, a conch shell. Sometimes just the harsh call of an overseer's voice cutting through the stillness. It is not yet dawn, but the enslaved stir from restless sleep, rising from dirt floors, brushing straw and dust from their clothes. The day has begun. Work begins at first light. The sun has barely broken the horizon when bodies already bend in the fields. There is no gentle start, no easing into the rhythm. The pace is immediate, urgent, relentless. For in this world, time itself belongs to someone else. In much of the South, the day means cotton. Endless rows stretch toward the horizon, plants low and thorned, their bowls sharp as they burst open. Fingers reach again and again, pulling the soft white fibers free. The motion repeats thousands of times in a single day. The burrs cut skin easily, slicing into fingertips until they are raw and bleeding. Calluses form, but they never quite protect against the sting. The sack slung across the back grows heavier as hours pass, the strap biting into the shoulder. At intervals, overseers weigh the sacks, checking quotas. Those who fall short risk punishment, the whip, the lash, humiliation before others. And so hands keep moving even as they ache, even as blood stains the cotton itself. Children as young as 6 or 7 are sent into the fields, picking alongside their parents. Their small fingers are nimble, but their backs tire quickly. The sun climbs, the heat intensifies, but the labor does not pause. By noon, sweat runs in rivers, shirts are soaked through, hats offer little relief. Yet the motion continues, bend, pull, stuff, repeat. In the coastal regions in South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, it is rice that defines the day. Unlike cotton, rice demands the swamp. Fields are flooded waist deep, the water warm and stagnant, buzzing with mosquitoes. Enslaved workers plant seedlings in precise rows, standing for hours in the muck, leeches clinging to legs, skin constantly bitten. The heat in the rice fields is suffocating, magnified by the still water that reflects the sun. Disease spreads easily, malaria, yellow fever. Fevers break bodies as much as the labor itself. Still the cycle continues, planting, weeding, harvesting. Sick or well, the quota remains. Tools are crude, a hoe, a sickle, a basket for carrying. Backs bend low, shoulders strain, and the swamp becomes a prison as inescapable as chains. By evening, the waterlogged fields have drained every ounce of strength, but still the enslaved rise to do it again at dawn. In the Caribbean and Louisiana, sugar reigns. It is one of the most brutal crops of all. The cane grows tall, its stalk sharp, the leaves slicing skin like knives. Cutting requires machetes swung again and again, the motion repetitive and dangerous. Accidents are common, hands gashed, legs wounded, but the real agony lies in the boiling houses. Here the cane is crushed, the juice extracted and boiled in great vats. The air is stifling, thick with steam and the sweet, sick smell of sugar. Men shovel fuel into furnaces, stir vats of boiling liquid, carry heavy buckets in endless motion. Burns are frequent, sometimes fatal. The sugar that sweetens tables elsewhere leaves scars on the bodies of those who produce it. In Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, tobacco defines the rhythm. Enslaved workers plant seedlings in neat rows, tend them for months, and harvest the sticky leaves in late summer. The resin clings to skin, staining fingers black, filling lungs with acrid dust. Leaves must be tied, cured in barns, sorted carefully. The work is less cutting but more constant. A season-long tending of a crop that demands attention every single day. Not all are in the fields. Some are pulled into the house, the barns, the workshops. House slaves rise before the family, lighting fires, preparing meals, drawing water, cleaning rooms. Their labor is less brutal to the body perhaps, but it comes with constant scrutiny. Every movement watched, every mistake punished, every moment a reminder of servitude within the master's closest sphere. Others are artisans, blacksmiths hammering iron, carpenters shaping wood, seamstresses sewing clothing. These skills are valuable, sometimes hired out for profit. But the earnings belong not to the worker, but to the enslaver. The craft may offer pride, but it is pride owned by another. Through it all, the overseer's presence hangs like a shadow. Some ride horses along the rows, watching, shouting, carrying whips that crack against the air as warning or punishment. Others patrol silently, eyes sharp, ready to note any slackening pace. Punishment is constant threat. Whippings for missing quotas, chains for attempting escape, stocks, collars, iron bits, all instruments designed to enforce fear. Some enslavers believed themselves lenient, but leniency never meant freedom. Even the gentlest master demanded profit from another's suffering. And yet, within this endless cycle, resistance found a place. A hoe swung more slowly, a sack filled more lightly. A tool accidentally broken, forcing a pause in work. A body feigning illness to steal a day's rest. These were not grand rebellions, but small refusals. Tiny acts of reclaiming self in a world that denied it. Songs, too, became resistance. A work chant carried across the rows turned monotony into rhythm, binding voices together in unity. The overseer heard only noise, but those within the song heard encouragement, memory, even coded words of hope. The long days end. The sun sinks slowly, but the day does not end until the overseer decides it. Bodies bent since dawn now straighten, though stiffly. Sacks of cotton, baskets of rice, bundles of cane, piles of tobacco, all are measured, inspected, tallied. The enslaved trudge back toward the quarters, their feet heavy, their clothes drenched with sweat, their bodies marked by labor. But even then, the day is not truly over. Some must still tend fires, cook meals, fetch water, repair tools. Women nurse children, soothe the sick, patch clothing by dim firelight. Men carve wood, mend shoes, prepare for tomorrow. Sleep comes late, shallow, often interrupted. The body is never fully rested before dawn calls again. And so the cycle repeats, sunup to sundown, season after season, year after year. This was the rhythm of life for millions, a rhythm not chosen but imposed, a rhythm designed to extract every ounce of labor, every breath of strength, and yet within it voices sang, hands resisted, hearts endured. The day's labor ends with darkness, but the mind does not rest. The body aches, the back bends, the hands sting from work, and yet the spirit looks for something beyond the fields. For many enslaved people, that beyond was found in faith. Not faith as preached from pulpits to justify bondage, but faith reshaped, reclaimed, and filled with meanings that no overseer could control. The enslavers knew religion was powerful. On some plantations, enslaved people were brought to church services where white ministers preached obedience. They turned the Bible into a tool of discipline, selecting passages that reinforced submission. Servants, obey your masters. Slaves, be subject. These verses were repeated, woven into sermons designed to make bondage sound like divine order. In some states, laws restricted gatherings of enslaved people for worship unless a white person was present. Enslavers feared that the Bible, if left unfiltered, might offer something dangerous. A promise of freedom, a call to resist, a story of deliverance. But away from white eyes in the woods, in brush arbors, in hidden clearings, a different faith flourished. These secret gatherings were called invisible churches. Here, scripture was not about obedience, but about hope. Moses became the central figure, a leader who stood before Pharaoh and demanded release. The Exodus was not ancient history, but a living story, a promise whispered in the dark. Let my people go. These services often began in whispers, voices low as lookouts watched for danger. But once gathered, the voices rose. Songs carried through the trees, prayers filled the air. Feet stamped against the ground in rhythm. The ring shout, a sacred dance, bodies circling, hands clapping, feet stomping, bound African rhythms to Christian belief. In these invisible churches, the enslaved were no longer property. They were children of God, equal before the Creator, heirs of a promised freedom. This belief sustained them, reminding each heart that bondage was not eternal. The Christianity practiced in the invisible churches was not simply borrowed from enslavers. It was transformed, blended with African spiritual traditions carried across the ocean. Call and response worship echoed patterns of African ritual. Songs drew on tonal slides and polyrhythms that connected worshipers to ancestors long silenced. Dreams and visions were given weight, believed to carry divine messages. In some regions, burial traditions kept African echoes alive. Shells were placed on graves, marking the soul's journey back across the water to the homeland. Names carried meanings, connecting children to both African heritage and Christian hope. This was not imitation of white religion. It was creation, a new tradition forged in the crucible of slavery, a faith both otherworldly and practical, both a prayer for heaven and a plan for survival. Faith was one fragile freedom, but it was not the only one. In countless small ways, enslaved people carved out spaces of autonomy. A garden behind the quarters might yield greens or yams that supplemented rations. A mother might save seeds, passing them down to her children, preserving both sustenance and heritage. These gardens were more than food. They were proof of independence, however small. Literacy, too, became a fragile freedom. For most enslaved people, learning to read was forbidden, punishable by law. Yet some secretly learned, taught by sympathetic whites or by enslaved people who had gained knowledge before restrictions tightened. A letter written in secret, a Bible read by candlelight, a word traced in the dirt for a child. These were dangerous acts, but they carried the promise of mental liberation. Courtship and marriage were also fragile freedoms. Enslaved people often married abroad, choosing partners from neighboring plantations. They visited one another when possible, often only on Saturday nights or Sundays. Ceremonies were simple, sometimes involving the ritual of jumping the broom. These unions were not recognized by law, yet they bound people together in love and commitment, a declaration that their humanity could not be erased. Even small journeys, an evening walk to see a spouse, a clandestine visit to family on another plantation, became moments of freedom. Though always shadowed by risk, they were chosen acts, expressions of will within lives tightly controlled. Every prayer, every song, every whispered word of Scripture carried resistance. To believe in a God of liberation was to deny the enslaver's claim of total power. To sing of heaven was to imagine a world beyond chains. To read the story of Exodus was to quietly declare that slavery would not last forever. The enslavers could dictate labor, punish bodies, break families apart. But they could not fully extinguish the belief that another world was possible. Faith became both shield and weapon, both comfort and defiance. The dual edge of hope, however, was a double-edged thing. For some, it brought strength, the ability to rise each morning, to endure one more day. For others, hope made the chains heavier, the gap between promise and reality unbearable. Some channeled hope into prayer, others into escape attempts, still others into everyday acts of survival. But without hope, life itself might collapse. Faith, fragile though it was, became a thread that bound enslaved communities together, holding them against despair. The night's end. As the night deepened, prayers whispered in the quarters, lingered in the smoky air. Mothers knelt with children, teaching them verses by memory. Fathers sang soft hymns, their voices low. Elders told stories of Africa, weaving memory with scripture, reminding the young that they belonged to something older, stronger than slavery itself. The faith carried in those moments was fragile, always under threat, always vulnerable to interruption by an overseer or the cruel force of law. And yet, it endured. It endured because it was not merely belief, it was survival. It was identity. It was a declaration that no matter what the laws said, no matter what the ledgers recorded, enslaved people belonged not to masters but to God, to one another, to a world beyond chains. And in that fragile freedom, in gardens, in marriages, in whispered literacy, in songs lifted to the sky, the enslaved carved out spaces where their humanity remained whole. If the day belonged to labor, the night often belonged to song. And while enslavers claimed ownership over bodies, no one could fully claim ownership over the human voice. In that voice lived memory, endurance, sorrow, and a hope that reached beyond the boundaries of the plantation. In the fields, music began as rhythm. Cotton required long hours of bending and plucking. Rice required stooping and planting in measured lines. Tobacco demanded steady tending, one row after another. Work was monotonous, endless, bone-wearing. But into this monotony came sound. A voice would rise, A single line, maybe just a phrase, "Oh Lord, how long?" Another voice answered. Soon the field carried with it a rhythm, call and response, weaving voices together, pushing bodies forward. The overseer may have heard only noise, but to the enslaved it was a tool. Work songs regulated pace, kept people together, made unbearable tasks slightly more bearable. They transformed silence into community. The songs carried traces of Africa. In West African traditions, labor was often accompanied by music, songs that set tempo, chants that called and answered. Though drums were outlawed in many colonies and states, voices became drums. The chest, the thigh, the clap of hands, the stomp of feet. These became instruments layered into sound. Even without drums, the rhythm endured. But songs were not only for work. At night, around fires in the secret gatherings of the invisible church, spirituals rose. These were songs of sorrow and longing, but also of resistance. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. The words captured the pain of families torn apart by sale, of children growing without parents, of parents mourning children lost. Yet the song did more than mourn. It connected each singer to the shared grief of the community, making sorrow bearable by carrying it together. Other spirituals reached upward toward hope. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. For some, home meant heaven, a release from suffering after death. For others, home meant freedom, the north, a life beyond slavery's grasp. In these double meanings lay strength. One song could speak to faith in eternity and to the possibility of earthly liberation. Steal Away to Jesus might sound like a simple hymn, but it could also signal a secret prayer meeting about to take place in the woods. Wade in the Water carried instructions for escape. To step into streams so bloodhounds could not track a runaway's scent. Songs became both worship and map, both prayer and plan. In the quarters, as the fire burned low and children fought sleep, softer songs were sung. Mothers crooned lullabies, often mixing African melodies with English words. Fathers hummed low chants, steady as heartbeats. These songs were private, not meant for overseers' ears, but for children who needed comfort in a world of fear. Through lullabies, heritage was passed. Even when names and places of origin were forgotten, sound carried the traces of Africa. Melodic slides, repeated phrases, syncopated rhythms. Fragments of a continent kept alive in the voice of a mother singing to her child. Not all music was voice alone. Despite bands, instruments persisted. The banjo, adapted from African prototypes, became a central instrument. Fiddles appeared too, often played at both enslaved and white gatherings. Drums were feared and outlawed in many places, but percussive tradition survived in subtler forms. Hands clapping, sticks beating, feet stomping in ring shouts. Dance accompanied song. In the ring shout, bodies moved in a circle, shuffling, clapping, singing, stamping. It was worship, but it was also memory. African ritual adapted into the framework of Christian belief. It was both sacred and communal, both prayer and dance, both past and future. The enslavers recognized the power of song, but they could not control it entirely. They might encourage singing in the fields, believing it made labor smoother. They might enjoy fiddle tunes played at their own parties. But they could not fully hear the hidden meanings, the messages carried in melody, the defiance woven into words. Song became survival. To sing was to resist despair. To sing was to claim identity in the face of erasure. To sing was to make a space where the enslaved were not property but human beings bound together in rhythm and hope. Even silence had its music. A hum while bending over cotton, a moan that rose in the night carrying grief into the air. A half-sung prayer in the dark, words slipping between speech and song. These sounds lingered in the quarters, filling spaces that words alone could not. These songs did not vanish when slavery ended. They lived on in spirituals sung in black churches, in blues that carried sorrow and resilience, in gospel that lifted voices heavenward, in jazz that bent rhythm into freedom. The music born in bondage became the foundation of American music itself. But in the quarters, in the fields, in the woods, these songs were more than heritage, they were survival. When ledgers recorded only crops and prices, songs remembered families, grief, and hope. When laws declared people property, songs declared them children of God, makers of beauty, keepers of rhythm. When silence threatened to erase them, music spoke their names into the air. Songs rose when nothing else could, and in them survival itself took shape, fragile, defiant, enduring. Few things weighed heavier on enslaved communities than the threat of separation. Labor was harsh, punishments were brutal. But the fear of losing a spouse, a child, a parent, or a sibling, that fear sat in the heart like a stone. Picture the scene: a city square in Charleston, Richmond, or New Orleans. A wooden platform is raised and human beings are lined up upon it. Men are told to flex their arms, to show their teeth, to walk back and forth like animals at market. Women are prodded, their bodies examined with a gaze both economic and violating. Children cling to mothers' skirts until hands tear them apart. The air is filled with sound. The auctioneers chant, the murmur of bidders, the occasional cry from those being sold. But for many, memory recalls it as silence, a kind of numbness that descended when the gavel struck and a family was broken forever. A boy might be sold to a plantation hundreds of miles away. A mother might be purchased by another owner, her children left behind. A husband might watch his wife taken from him with no hope of reunion. The violence of the whip left scars on the body, but the violence of separation left scars that never healed. After the international slave trade was banned in 1808, the domestic trade expanded. This second Middle Passage uprooted more than 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and forced them into the Deep South where cotton and sugar demanded new labor. Families were marched in chains, coffles stretching for miles along dusty roads. Others were crammed into ships or wagons, transported to markets farther south. The journeys were long, grueling, humiliating. For those left behind, there was only absence. For those forced away, there was the crushing weight of dislocation. The sound of chains rattling on the road became part of the landscape. Entire communities were emptied, scattered across states, their kinship ties torn apart. In the face of separation, enslaved people clung to memory. Parents taught children to repeat family names aloud, to remember siblings, uncles, cousins. This is your brother, that was your aunt, remember. Spoken words became records when no written records were allowed. Some families developed naming practices to keep memory alive. A child might be named after a lost parent, a grandparent, or a sibling taken away. In names, bloodlines persisted even when bodies were scattered. When children were sold, those left behind sometimes became adoptive kin. A grandmother took in orphans. Neighbors became uncles and aunts. Kinship stretched beyond blood, built from the necessity of survival. Families were not only biological, they were chosen, rebuilt, reimagined. Much of this history remains unrecorded. Enslavers kept ledgers of prices, weights, and ages, but rarely names. They wrote of prime male age 20 or girl age 12, but not the stories of those lives. Paper recorded profit, not humanity. What remains in history are silences. The silences of names unremembered, the silences of families who never found one another again. The silences of grief too heavy for words, and yet silence itself becomes testimony. To read the absence is to understand the scale of loss. To feel the hollowness in the record is to glimpse the vastness of what was destroyed. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, interviewers from the Works Progress Administration, WPA, gathered oral histories from elderly, formerly enslaved people. Their voices carried memories of separation that had haunted them for decades. Some spoke of mothers crying at auction blocks. Others recalled being children clinging to parents until they were torn away. Many still did not know what had happened to their kin even 70 years later. The loss was not just momentary. It was lifelong. One woman remembered being sold at age 9, carried away from her mother, never to see her again. Another recalled his father being sold, leaving the family without protection. These voices remind us that separation was not abstract. It was lived, endured, and remembered. Even when not happening, the fear of sale hovered constantly. A knock at the cabin door could mean an overseer come to take someone away. A whisper of debt, a rumor of a master's death could mean an entire family would soon be divided. Nothing was secure. No bond was guaranteed. This fear shaped the way enslaved people loved. They loved fiercely, urgently, knowing it might not last. They held children close, knowing tomorrow could steal them away. They built marriages with devotion, even without legal recognition, because they knew bonds of love were stronger than the law that denied them. In the aftermath of separation, silence often followed. There were tears, yes, but also long silences. The absence of a voice at the fire, the emptiness of a space in the cabin. Sometimes silence was mourning. Sometimes it was protection. To not speak was to shield oneself from despair. But even silence carried meaning. It bore witness to what could not be expressed. It preserved grief when words were too fragile. It reminded those who remained that they were not alone in their loss. Despite separation, enslaved people found ways to endure. They created new kinship bonds, built new families, found comfort in community. The strength to survive came from these remade ties, from the determination to keep living despite heartbreak. Through song, they carried memory. Through prayer, they imagined reunion. Through silence, they honored absence. Today, much of what we know of these separations comes from fragments: a bill of sale, a newspaper advertisement for a runaway, a letter from an enslaver. Rarely do we have the voices of the enslaved themselves, and yet the fragments, when pieced together, reveal a vast story of rupture, 1,000,000 families broken apart, generations reshaped by absence, a legacy of grief that still echoes. The silence is part of the record. It is not emptiness, it is testimony to what was taken, to what was endured, to what was lost and what survived. We have walked slowly through fragments of a world that was built to be forgotten. Cabins of smoke and dirt, fields that swallowed years, songs that rose against silence, families broken yet somehow rebuilt in whispers and memory. Slavery in the United States was not a footnote. It was not an edge of history. It was the foundation, the wealth of a nation laid on the backs of the enslaved. Cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, all carried in calloused hands. And yet in the ledgers and records it is rarely the people we find, only the products of their labor. But when we pause, when we listen carefully, we can hear what survives. A story told to a child in the dark, a rhythm stamped into the earth, a name repeated so it will not be lost, a melody that still moves through churches and choirs today, carrying both sorrow and strength. This is not a story that ends neatly. It does not fade with the last page of a textbook. Its echoes remain in the song still sung, in the family still searching for their roots, in the silence that asks us to listen harder. So as the lights dim and the night deepens, take a breath. Let the weight of this history rest for a moment. It is heavy, yes, but it is also enduring. In smoke-filled cabins, in midnight gatherings, in whispered prayers, people carved meaning from suffering and left behind not only silence but resilience. We are here, listening. And that too is a kind of remembrance. Good night.